Hi there folks, Evan here, and this week we're going to be focusing on responsive design for web development. Now last week we briefly mentioned adaptive design and responsive design, but we're going to dive a little deeper in this week. This week is going to be entirely about designing your sites, building your sites responsively. So let's start with talking about what responsive design actually is. Responsive design is building a website which will respond to the size of the screen on which it is displayed. So put another way, a website whose layout can change and can fluidly respond to the size of the screen is a website that can display properly and appropriately on laptop and desktop and tablet and mobile and in portrait mode and in landscape mode, etc., etc., etc. In the age of consumer electronics, the sizes of screens, or rather the variations in the size of screens on all these devices, are multiplying like crazy. There are so many different screen sizes out there now on which consumers can reasonably expected to visit your site that it is almost impossible to really design specifically for all of them. Now back in the old days, big companies used to have separate sites for separate devices. You used to have to go to a site like m.google.com in order to use Google on your mobile phone. In fact, I think Yahoo still does this. But regardless, that is adaptive design. Design in which there is a completely separate version of a website for a specific device. Responsive design is the way of the future. It's the way businesses have been moving consistently for several years. And it is extremely important for staying an adept and versatile developer in the future. So why is responsive design important? Well, the number of consumer devices on which people are visiting, on which people are surfing the web, are multiplying. The variety of those devices are multiplying, and screen sizes are constantly changing. Resolutions are constantly changing. So responsive design is important because it allows your website and your content to fluidly adapt to this changing landscape. It's kind of like future-proofing your site. If you can build your website responsively and with responsiveness in mind, then it doesn't matter if the next version of the iPhone has an entirely different resolution, or if Android comes up with another 7 different varieties of tablet. Your site should be able to appropriately display their information and change its layout on any of them or all of them, or at the very least on most of them. What are the 3 types of devices on which consumers visit websites? Well, the 3 most common are mobile phone, tablets, and laptops. And of course, above laptops, there are desktop monitors, which can be super high resolution. You know, they're up to 4K now. They've got the extra long curved monitors now. There are a lot of different kinds of mobile phones and tablets. And of course, both mobile and tablet can be oriented in landscape mode or in portrait mode. Okay, portrait mode up and down, landscape mode left and right. And both of those modes call for potentially different layouts as well. So that's number 3. At least one of these devices has 2 different viewing modes. What are they? Those viewing modes are portrait and landscape. Now, what does the meta viewport element do? What does the meta viewport element do? Well, that is an element, and don't try to memorize this. This is something that you can very easily Google, the meta viewport tag, and W3 Schools has one ready for us to use. Here we go. So this is the meta viewport tag, and you should definitely copy this and paste it in the head element of your template right above the title. And what this does is it essentially enables our media queries, which are going to be the subject of this week, to work. Okay? The meta viewport sets the initial zoom level. It determines what our browser's reference point for screen size is going to be. There's a lot behind what the meta viewport tag does, but the long and short of it is it allows us to design responsively. It lets our media queries work. Okay, so if in the future you're coding in media queries and you find some media queries aren't behaving the way you expect, the first thing you want to check is going to be your meta viewport tag. Make sure it's correct, make sure you have one, make sure it's working. How do you view Chrome's mobile developer tools? Well, simple. You open your inspector, and in the top left, right next to the little button which we click to highlight specific elements, there is another button, and it looks like a tablet behind a small mobile phone. If I click on that or hit Control-Shift-M, it will convert the page that I'm currently on to a mobile viewport. So this is an example of what this site would look like on an iPhone X. I can also see it on an iPad Pro. And this circle, which is now my cursor, represents a finger. If I click, it's like I'm pulling or tapping or swiping. And this will show me how the site looks and behaves on these different devices. So that can be a really useful tool. You can also customize the resolution if you're designing for a particularly strange aspect ratio. The mobile developer tools are really helpful, but they're not the be-all, end-all of understanding how to change your layout for different devices. As useful as they are, I still personally find it much more useful to simply change the size of your browser window. So this would represent a mobile viewport. And something like this would represent a tablet in portrait mode. And something like this, a tablet in landscape mode maybe, etc., etc., etc. Okay. What you never ever want to do, I'm just going to say this now, what you never want to do is design for the one jerk out there who's going to be viewing your site like this. Okay? You don't want to code an entirely separate layout for your site for every possible variation of viewport. That's just not, it's not worth the time, the effort, the brain power. It is not an optimal or economical use of your time and skills. Okay? What is the difference between the max width CSS property and max width in a media query? Well, that's a fair question. The max width CSS property simply sets the maximum width of an element. So if I had an image element, and in fact, let's try this. I'm just going to create an image element here in my HTML. No CSS currently. Let's open this in browser. Okay, there's our image. It's huge. It's absolutely huge. Let me go ahead and style it so it's a little more manageable. I'm going to give it a width of 500 pixels. All right, so now our image is 500 pixels. It has a very defined prescribed width of 500 pixels, and it's going to stay 500 pixels for as long as it needs to. Max width is a little bit different in that it sets a maximum width for this image. So it's going to be a maximum width of 500 pixels, but it can be smaller. Now initially, we don't see any difference. There's no change. The image still gets cut off when our website, when our browser window gets small enough. But we can combine max width 500% with width 100%. And what that is going to do is the image is going to want to be 100% of the width of its container, which in this case is the body, but it's going to cut that off at 500 pixels. So it's never going to be larger than 500 pixels, but watch what happens when I scale my window down. When my window gets too small for the image scales down. Under 500 pixels, it allows itself to be 100% the width of its container. So in a case like this, I'm kind of planning ahead. I'm thinking I want my image to be full screen, or full width of my screen at mobile and maybe at tablet, but eventually I don't want it to be enormously huge if someone's viewing this on a laptop or a desktop. So I'm going to set a maximum width, which is just like a cutoff point for this width 100%. So all in all, this helps me define some very specific parameters and make my image slightly responsive. It does scale and change size with my screen size. Okay, so that's max width as a CSS property. As a media query, max width defines CSS, which is due to work or kick in up to a maximum width of whatever you define. Up to a maximum width of whatever you define. So let's try this a different way and show a max width media query. I'm going to set my image to have a width of 500 pixels. It will no longer scale. It's now no longer responsive. It gets cut off. But let me open my inspector. Let me see just when my screen is too small. I'm going to do 768 pixels. If you're not sure what I'm looking at, look in the top right of my window, about right here. As I adjust my window size with my inspector open, I can see the exact pixel dimensions of my page, or of the window at least. So I'm going to, below my image, write at media, max width. I'm going to go for 768 pixels. This is actually a fairly common breakpoint. Okay, so I've defined a max width media query, and within this media query, I'm once again going to select my image and change its width to 100%. And what this means is up to a maximum width of 768 pixels. So as long as my window is at or below 768 pixels wide, my image will be 100% wide, rather than 500 pixels. So think about it. It's as though when my screen is at a certain size, when my window is at a certain size, this bit of CSS is simply tacked on to the bottom of our CSS style sheet. As a result, this width overrides this width when this media query is working. Okay, so let's see it in action. Reload my page. Okay, so, there we go, 500 pixels, 500 pixels. And as soon as we get down to a smaller size, it scales down. It scales responsively. It's now at 100% width. The reason why it looks like it's going beyond the dimensions that I defined is because I'm actually pretty zoomed in here. Here we go. Yeah. So this is how we expect it to behave, but I'm zoomed in for convenience's sake. Alright, so what we did here with this max width media query is essentially the exact same thing that we accomplished before by simply adding max width below width. So in this case, max width as a media query is actually a little verbose, but that's not always the case. In fact, most of the time, a media query is going to be the way to go. I just don't want you to be confused into thinking that max width in a media query in any way relates to the actual width of the elements selected inside. Okay? This max width, and conversely the corresponding min width, only refers to the width of your window. Okay, so if I change this to min width, At min width, this defines code that will kick in and start working when your window is at or above a size of 768 pixels wide. Okay, so in this case, I'd probably switch these to achieve the same effect, but let's just see what it looks like without switching them first. So now our image is 100% wide, no matter how big we get, until it gets super pixelated. But once we drop down to a small enough window size, it locks into 500 pixels wide, because this code is no longer working. Okay, so again, a sensible developer would probably switch these with 100% normally, and with 500 pixels at or above a 768 pixel window, and that would bring us back to the original effect we were dealing with. All right, let's move on. When should a developer choose, number 7, what is the difference between min width and max width in a media query? Well, we did just address that. So, when should a developer choose to use min width instead of max width in a media query, or vice versa? That's a good question, so think about it. If you're developing a web page with max width media queries, you're probably going to start with something like max width, I don't know, 1200 pixels maybe, and then 768 pixels, and then maybe 400 pixels. And these, of course, would all be different values. Let's say 450 pixels, 300 pixels. This is if we really wanted to precisely control exactly how big our image is. Which isn't, this isn't best practice code here. This doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but this is how we would structure our media queries. So think about what do you see here? What pattern do you see here? And can you think about how this would work in the opposite fashion? These are a bunch of max width media queries which are getting smaller and smaller in size, which means we're starting from a layout that is appropriate for a larger screen size. We might be starting from designing for desktop or laptop first, and then gradually we add media queries for smaller and smaller devices, smaller and smaller screens. Conversely, if these were all min-width media queries, our code would very likely be set up differently. The vanilla CSS up here would reflect the smallest possible layout, and then we would gradually get larger from there. Something like that. Which is to say, when you use min-width media queries, and you would rarely, if ever, use both min-width and max-width media queries at the same time, but when you see min-width media queries, that usually suggests that a site has been developed mobile first. It's been developed with a layout for the smallest possible screen size in mind, and then they build up one at a time, one by one. To be honest, to really make these effective, we would need to reorder them so they go from smallest to largest to make sure that this CSS, when it's kicked in, has the most power over all of the rest. Okay, so min-width media queries are used in mobile-first websites. Max-width are used in laptop or desktop-first websites. What does display none do? Why might we use it inside of media queries? Jump back a little bit. Okay, so display none. Let me just add it to this image here. Display none. The image disappears. Display none actually hides an element completely. The element is still there. See in my Elements tab, the image element itself has still been loaded. It still exists. It's still recognized in the document object model or in our live code. But that display none property has caused it to hide. If I turn it off in my styles tab, I can cause it to pop in and out. Okay, so display none actually hides an element. Now, why might that be useful? Think about it. On a mobile screen size, you have a lot less room to display lots of information. It gets crowded very, very quickly, and sometimes you need to remove elements as the screen gets smaller in order to accommodate your layout. You just have to. As the screen gets smaller, you have to more carefully prioritize the information that is being presented. It's a very important skill, and it's a very important judgment for web developers to make. And display none is inside a media query like this is an effective way of hiding an element under certain conditions. Okay, so with this, I reload my page. Our image is visible, it's visible, it's visible, and then it's not. Okay, and this is something especially relevant to things like images, or if you have videos, or other heavy hitters in terms of website load times. On a mobile device, websites tend to load slower. They just do. Mobile is not as fast as laptops or desktops. And as a result, you almost never see auto-playing videos on mobile sites. Images are often severely downscaled if they're present at all. So a technique like display none, used in conjunction with media queries, can really help keep your site lean and performant even on smaller screen sizes. And it allows you to take very precise control of your information hierarchy under different conditions. What is the maximum number of media queries you should use per website? Well, I mean, that's a personal question, but really you should probably confine yourself to 3 or 4. One for each, drastically different condition or screen size. Mobile, tablet, laptop, maybe a 4th one for a big desktop screen or something. You might have more if you have a number of particularly unique elements that require some kid gloves, some precise handling to keep perfect and looking just so on all these different screen sizes. But in general, you want to confine yourself. Do not go crazy with your media queries. It is not worth the time or effort. It really isn't. Should you create a separate CSS file for media queries? No, you should not. You should always write your media queries inside your main.css file, and they should always be at the end of your main.css file. The reason why they should be at the end is because they need to overwrite your existing CSS when they kick on. Alright, number 13. What type of code goes inside of media queries? Well, that's simply regular old CSS. Regular old CSS of any kind. There's no restriction on selectors. There's no restriction on type or number of properties. There's no restriction at all. The only thing to keep in mind is, let me demonstrate. Let me get rid of that. Let me demonstrate something real quick. I'm going to give this image here an ID of Hellboy. Okay, and here in my CSS, for this very first selector, I'm going to select it, rather than using the element selector, image, I'm going to select it with image #Hellboy. So the image element with the ID of Hellboy. And I'm going to reload my page. Notice now Oh, my mistake. Let's change this display none to width 100%. Notice now how the image does not scale down. Its width has not changed to this 100% at a max screen width of 500 pixels. It hasn't. And if I look down in my Styles tab, well, I see the original 500 pixel width there. And when my screen is small enough, down below, I see my media query. I see width 100%, but it's crossed out. This width 100% is actually being overridden by the vanilla CSS up top. So think about why that is. It's because in CSS, specificity is always king. In other words, the fact that I used an ID selector to select this image means that this element selector inside my media query is not specific enough to cause this code to override this code. What that means is, when you're writing your media queries and you need to flip on some new styles for an element, you need to be at least as specific as you were outside of your media queries. Your selectors in your media queries need to be at least as specific as the vanilla CSS. Okay, at least as specific. If I do that, if I change it so that my selector is as specific, or more specific, if you can, then my image will now successfully scale the way that we want it to. Okay. Number 14. If you write a media query for your website and find that your code is not responding the way you expect it to, what is the very first thing that you should check when troubleshooting? Well, the very first thing, as we discussed, is that meta viewport tag. Always make sure that meta viewport tag is complete and correct and working. What is the second thing? The second thing should be the media query itself. Media query itself. Make sure there's no typo. Make sure you didn't leave out the @ sign. Make sure that you didn't put a semicolon inside those parentheses. I see students do this a lot, and it makes sense. It's a good habit. It comes from writing CSS properties and values with correct syntax, but that semicolon doesn't belong in there. It will break the code. Make sure that your media query uses a hyphen. Max width or min width is used using a hyphen. Make sure that there's the colon between the width and the actual dimensions. Make sure it's not max width equals 500 pixels. Nope, that's not right. Make sure it's not a hyphen. It has to be colon. Okay, and finally, make sure that the media query itself has an opening curly brace and a closing curly brace. Okay, especially when we get to writing a lot of media query and a lot of CSS inside these media queries, I often will see something like this. Okay, students here think that they've closed their media query because there's a curly brace that's on the same vertical line, but in reality the browser is going to read this curly brace as the counterpart to this curly brace, which means this media query never closed and we have an error. It's not going to read. Okay, so make sure both of your curly braces are present. In your text editor, if you hover your cursor, if you drop your cursor next to one of those curly braces, the counterpart will be underlined. See, if I drop my cursor here, this curly brace is now underlined. Might be a little difficult to see in the video, but trust me, it's there. So never be afraid to check that all of your curly braces have an appropriately placed counterpart. Easy mistake to make. You could also plug it into a validator, and a CSS validator would catch that issue in a heartbeat. What is the third thing you should look at? Well, the third thing that you should look at is your selector. is the selector for the CSS you're trying to kick on at least as specific as the selector with the code that is not being overridden? Okay, that's the third thing you want to look for. And you can certainly start by looking in your code, but I'd also recommend using your inspector. Open up your inspector, highlight the element that isn't being affected the way you expect, and look through your styles tab. Make sure that your styles are not crossed out and being overridden where they shouldn't be, like with this with 100% before. And make sure that the styles you do want to be overridden are crossed out. Number 15. How do we include animate.css in our HTML file? Well, I'm going to go over to, I'm just going to Google actually animate.css, and it should be the very first thing that pops up. Okay, now this is a great library of what they call just headwater CSS animations. They're really easy to create. And if I open this drop-down menu, I can see all these different varieties of animations that we can use, and we can see what they look like. So rotate in, down, left, fade out, right, wobble. Okay, so these are all animations that we can use to incorporate animate.css into your project. You're going to download Animate CSS. Notice when I click on the button, it opens up this page, but if you look closely, this is all just CSS code. Now, it's complicated CSS code. You might not recognize everything you see, but you should be able to recognize that it is very clearly CSS syntax. More than that, the URL actually ends in animate.css, which means this is a CSS file, and that's all we need. So I'm going to right-click, Save As, and I'm going to put it in my template. And I'm going to save this file in my CSS folder next to my main.css. And now in my project folder, I can see animate.css right next to main.css. So we're almost ready to use it. Very last thing that we need to do is in our index, we need another link tag. Let me do this below Font Awesome. I'm going to write link, rel equals style sheet, href equals css / animate.css. So exactly like our main.css link, only targeting the animate.css file. And I'm going to write myself a comment here to label it. Now, animate.css is hooked up to our index.html, and we can use it. The next question is, how do we animate an element using animate.css? Well, let's say I want to make this image. Let's find an animation. Let's say I want to make it fade in up. Fade in up. So I want it to fade in up when the page loads. The only thing I need to do, very easy, is add a class attribute to this image and give this class the value of animated space fade in up. So I save that, and when I reload my page, the image fades in up. So that's how you can use Animate CSS. Once the CSS file is linked to your HTML, you can give any element on your page the class of animated, followed by the class of the name of the animation that you want it to perform. And you can find the names of those animations right here. There are a bunch. Okay, so if I wanted it to bounce in up, I would simply change fade in up to bounce in up. Let's see what that looks like. There we go. Last question. What additional class can we add to an element to make an Animate CSS animation loop forever? Well, let's change this animation to something more like pulse. Let's do pulse, animated pulse, and see what that looks like. Okay, so the image pulses. If I want that to repeat forever, to loop, then I can simply add an additional class here of infinite. And now the image will pulse forever. Okay? So we're going to be using Animate CSS more in later weeks, especially later on when we hit jQuery and start exploring timed animations triggered by JavaScript. But for now, Animate.css can be a really effective way to make your sites feel a hell of a lot more professional and polished right off the bat. You can have your elements fade in or swoop in or bounce in when the page loads. You can have your buttons animate in a certain way when a user clicks on them or hovers on them. You can even use these classes to animate the transitions of your media queries. But don't worry too much about that just yet. For now, try to wrap your head around how these media queries work, what role they play in web development, and start paying attention when you go out there in the world and you visit sites. Start paying attention to how things look differently on your mobile phone and on your laptop. Try visiting the same site on both devices and thinking about how is the layout different. What CSS could have been added to cause it to switch from the desktop layout to the mobile layout? Start exploring these questions, even if it's just conceptually, just big picture, or just paper prototype, and that will really help you understand how these media queries work and how we're going to be using them.